Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan Jeyarajah and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan Jeyarajah, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We are glad to have you with us. And what a weekend, right? The penultimate weekend of the regular season was stupendous. For those of you out there who enjoy drama and chaos anyway, and well, we certainly do, we're going to take a look at Week 13 as we try to figure out who stays on our Survivor Island. Then, and in this chaotic scenario, we're going to try and take a look who, if anyone, is a lock for the inaugural 12-team playoff at this point, which is bonkers to say, as again, one more week of the regular season, the conference championship games, and then for the purposes of the playoff and exhibition game between Army and Navy. And then the playoff begins. But before we dive in, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Please take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your shows. All of that said, hello, Shehan. How are you doing today?
I'm good. It's a big week this week. Look, everybody pays so much attention to rivalry week, but like sometimes people pay too much attention to rivalry week, and that's when a week like week 13 happens, when you've got teams like Alabama going on the road and losing by 3 touchdowns to the worst Oklahoma team of my entire life. Actually, that's not true. I was still alive technically in 1998 when John Blake was coaching, but like since then, you get results like Ole Miss throwing multiple interceptions because one interception was overturned, so they had to go right back and throw another one to lose to Florida. Both Big 12 potential finalists in Colorado and BYU lose. Like, this was an insane week of football. I think that the final count was at 7 teams in the top 25 lost. But now all of a sudden, if you are a team on the bubble, stay in line. Stay in line. You are going to get in because the bubble is wide open now.
There was that wonderful kind of flip in the middle of the day after Indiana lost, and there was all this joy coming out of the 2-loss SEC teams before most of them lost and completely reversed the whole situation on who might still be in the playoff race. So we're going to be talking about, frankly, how that all fits together in just a moment. So as a quick reminder, our format is fairly simple. We have a Survivor Island, and it has a maximum of 12 teams that can be on it. We must vote off one team each week, which is a little more complicated when everyone wins. Don't worry, we have plenty of options this week. And we don't have to only vote off one. So again, after we vote a team off, we then decide if there are going to be teams we want to add back. Because of the nature of the 2024 12-team playoff format, we are going to keep at least one team from the Power Four. So if we eliminate all the teams from the Big 12 or the ACC, we have to replace them with at least one team. And we have to have at least one G5 program. If the G5 program is replaced, we also have to look to the rest of the teams and figure out if there's a P4 we also need to replace as well. All that said, a lot of these details we haven't had to worry about because it's been surprisingly frozen in the G5. And meanwhile, boy, has excitement reigned in the P4. And this has been everything people wanted out of a 12-team playoff, where there are just so many storylines, so many things going on. Just a quick, it's so funny too. Like I used to say, like, well, these teams have played their way out. I'm like, I honestly don't even know who's played their way out at this point. I do know, as we were just talking about this, like the Big 12 released a statement on Sunday that 9 teams are still in the race for the conference championship. There are some amazing flowcharts out there trying to solve that, but it is absolutely that is by far the king. But SEC is full of other questions on who's even going to play Georgia now. Georgia picked the best time to end their season, at least in the conference season, I should say. They had UMass, and then they've got the Georgia Tech game, but neither of which affect the SEC standing. So they're, fortunately for them, they're the one lock in that conference, at least to be playing in that game. So all of that said, I'm going to go over who our teams were on our Survivor Island heading into Week 13. It was Oregon. They had a bye, no problem. They've got the rivalry with Washington coming up. Ohio State played a big game we're going to be talking about, hosting number 5 Indiana and beating them soundly 38-15. They've got the game, FBS edition anyway. I see Harvard Yale. They have the game against Michigan coming up. They're actually technically TBD on being in their own conference title game because they need to win. Otherwise, they need Penn State and Indiana to lose. Texas had no problems against Kentucky. They were like the one team that got talked about the least, it felt, this weekend in the top 5. They've got the Lone Star Showdown coming up at Texas A&M, something I know Shehan's going to be covering. They need to beat Texas A&M to get in that SEC title game. We had Penn State. Wow, they should just be glad they won. And Minnesota, my hometown Gophers, gave them a heck of a run there, but they've got their next game against Maryland. They need that win at Maryland, and they would need an Ohio State loss to go into the Big Ten title game if they even wanted to go in the Big Ten title game at this rate. Indiana, of course, they lost to Ohio State in that major game that everyone was paying attention to. They've got the old Oaken Bucket hosting Purdue. They need to win that and have losses by Penn State and Ohio State in order to be in that Big Ten title game. Notre Dame crushed the dreams of Army. They, as well as they had previously with Navy. I don't even know it was worse than Navy. No, it wasn't quite. It wasn't quite as bad of a score as the Navy game, but they decisively beat them. They've got the battle for the Jewel Shillelagh against USC coming up this weekend. Alabama, we'll be talking about them. Oklahoma, woo, that was a loss for the ages. We're going to come back to that one in a bit. They've got, of course, the Iron Bowl as well. Ole Miss, Florida took care of them. They've got the Egg Bowl fist fight coming up this weekend against Mississippi State. Georgia picked a great time to be playing UMass, although UMass, again, it's a good week to not have your greatest game in history because there were too many other games to pay attention to. They've got, of course, clean old-fashioned hate coming up against Georgia Tech and the SEC title game, which they are locked in. Finally, we have 2 more teams, three more after this. Goodness. Boise State. Again, they squeaked by Wyoming, and we're not going to talk too much about that game, but again, they got lucky there a little bit. Ashton Jeanty was a little banged up. They have a game with Oregon State, not a storied rivalry game, before they are, again, a lock for the Mountain West Championship game against either UNLV or Colorado State, although UNLV is in the driver's seat right now. SMU beat Virginia really handily, 33-7. They have their nascent rivalry game with Cal this weekend. And then they are a lock for the ACC Championship game, the only lock right now. BYU lost again in that incredible finale to the Arizona State game where Arizona State's fans rushed the team twice. We saw the Kenny Dillingham quotes to the referees immediately afterwards. They have a game with Houston. They're still in this mysterious Big 12 race. So those were our 12 teams. I'm just going to note we had several teams that are sitting outside. We'll probably be talking about Miami, which is now the AP number 8. Tennessee, AP number 7, which may have been the best winner in the SEC this entire weekend. Texas A&M, Colorado, AP number 23, which lost, but it's the Big 12, so, hey, who knows? Clemson, AP number 12. Colorado 23, as I probably mentioned. Arizona State, AP number 14. Iowa State, AP number 17. And then finally, you got the other G5s, which are Army, Tulane, and UNLV. This is probably the most teams we have to potentially discuss of any week we've had other than maybe week 1. Shehan, what are your thoughts just about how all of these teams went through? General thoughts. I'm not asking you to break down each one.
Well, you don't want me to go through 21 teams or whatever?
Yeah. What are your thoughts on? No, sorry.
So I will say, if you are a team right now, and I'm looking hard at the Big 12, if you are at a team right now that suffered early upsets, you gotta be kicking yourself right now. This was a year, this was a field that was primed for opportunities for teams to get into the field from the non-Big 2 conferences. Because look, when you look at it right now, I think that the Big 10 is in pretty good position with potentially Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, and Indiana. In the SEC, you want to talk about teams that are a sure thing, there are not a lot of them right now when you talk about teams making the field. So, you could have had a second Big 12 team. We're going to see potentially a second ACC team with SMU and Miami potentially both having a chance to get in. Uh, like Iowa State, and Iowa State dealt with some injuries. It's not fully that they just struggled or failed, but like you got to be kicking yourself if you're Iowa State. This could have been the greatest season in your history, and instead you're probably on the outside looking in. Similar deal. I mean, again with BYU. BYU was right in the middle of the race for so long they just fell off. Colorado this last week against Kansas, they kind of unravel. It's just you have to be kicking yourself if you are right on the cusp, because one or two close games might have ruined what could have been potentially a historic season for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is. I mean, Kansas is the poster child for that. They seem to be the strongest team right now in that conference. I know you've been bullish on their recent performance, but a little too. I mean, well, not too little, too late. They are absolutely being a wrecking ball in that conference and making everybody know the Jayhawk name. But as far as their ceiling, they would need to beat Baylor to even be bowl eligible at this point. Is that correct?
Yes, they're 5-6 right now.
Well, I know it was so funny. I know I've shared this at least with some friends. There were Kansas fans after they beat BYU said we are destined to beat Colorado and lose on a walk-off field goal to Baylor. So we'll see if that prophecy is fulfilled. But we have all of these teams. Which teams do we need? Well, so let's just get the losses out of the way. We obviously Indiana lost, Alabama lost, BYU lost, Ole Miss lost. What do we think here? Like, which team is the easiest one to either say stay or go? Do any of these guys deserve to stay without a doubt?
Well, let's go through which ones deserve to go, actually. Let's do it that way. And I think that the first team to consider to be kicked out is Indiana. Because Indiana has a pretty straightforward case. They're going to be, most likely, if they can beat Purdue next week, they're going to be an 11-1 team in the Big Ten. And yes, they lost against Ohio State. Ohio State might also be the best team in the country. So I think that they would have been in an interesting spot if every one of the SEC teams had taken care of business. And you're potentially talking about 11-1 Indiana or like 10-2 Ole Miss that has a win over Georgia. But that's not reality anymore. Indiana, I think, firmly deserves to be in our field, firmly deserves to be in the college football playoff. And by the way, when we asked, should Indiana be removed from our list of CFP contenders on social media, it was a runaway vote. 76% said no, they should not be removed at this point.
Yeah, I think realistically, they're going to probably fall to where the AP poll has them. And I've been seeing, I mean, we've talked about this. It's been talked about for now several years. The AP poll and the college football playoff rankings tend to be somewhat similar enough that you can kind of get an idea of what the rankings are going to look like. And I think Indiana falling into the bottom slots is certainly possible. They're going to be a road team for sure. In fact, if the AP poll were taken right now as the college football playoff seeding, Indiana would end up playing at Penn State in the opening game, which would be something else. But yeah, I agree. Indiana, you've earned at least an opportunity to stay. You don't have to get on life raft. You can stay, but you're at the edge of the island right now. You're not near the center. Next up. Well, I think BYU needs to be next up because they were one where we were debating about whether or not they should stay or not, only because of the very nature of the big. We were wondering like if they lose, well, Colorado, but then Colorado lost. So
yep,
they actually wait. Let's table them for a second because that's going to be one of the hardest ones to unravel. Let's move on to our SEC candidates. Alabama, we all took it for granted that they were going to win. We were saying like, gosh, whoever gets Alabama in that first round, who wants that? Who wants a prepared Kalen DeBoer team? Well, I don't. We saw what happens when they're not prepared. Oklahoma, my goodness. I mean, the number of kind of how long it has been since Alabama scored that few. How long it has been. I mean, I can't even imagine. Like, I haven't been paying attention to what the Alabama fans have been saying, but I can't imagine it's been great. But should they still be, are they even a playoff contender anymore? The AP dropped them to number 13, and people are kind of peeved about that. Like, I didn't put this tweet up, but someone put a comparison but someone in our group put up the comparison of Alabama and Duke and who their losses have been to, and Duke looked better. So, granted, Alabama's beat some better teams. I mean, being Georgia is certainly something I don't know if Duke could do. But all of that said, what
Well,
do
they
we
haven't gotten the chance to try.
Yeah, exactly.
They can handle Georgia, no problem. So the stats are: this is the biggest non-con or the biggest unranked loss that Alabama's taken since 1998. It's the least points that they've scored in a game since 2004. It's the first time that they've failed to score a touchdown in a game since the 9-6 game against LSU back in 2011. So needless to say, this is not what you wanted to see from the University of Alabama. I personally think that they're out. I do think that they're out because here's the piece of it, right? So they have that win over Georgia, which was real and was meaningful, absolutely. Their win against South Carolina had them at the buzzer. Like, should have beat them, arguably. I think, and this is a personal thing, I think Missouri and LSU are not good. Like, I think that they are not good teams. I've been banging the Missouri sucks drum for a long time, and thankfully Missouri. Yeah, they just, and I feel bad about it. Like, I expected them to be better, but they have just not been good. And obviously, they lose on the road against South Carolina last week. So, like, I don't give a whole lot of credit to them for how they beat Missouri and LSU. I just don't think that they're good teams, honestly. And so I just don't think that, like, Alabama's case at this point is kind of outlasting Georgia in a game that they nearly blew, and then, like, being about the same as South Carolina 6 weeks ago. I don't love that. And then you have this game against Oklahoma, which, like, everybody's gonna talk about. Oh my gosh, losing at Vanderbilt is like the worst loss that we've ever seen. No, it's not.
Who knew?
First of all, Arkansas and Kentucky are both teams that playoff contenders lost to. Ole Miss lost to Kentucky earlier in the year. That's a way worse loss than Vanderbilt. And then Ole Miss Tennessee lost to Arkansas as well in a 19-14 game. Both of those losses were way worse than Vanderbilt. But this year, 24-3 at Oklahoma is worse than any of them. Like, that is as bad a loss as there has been in college football this year with the way that Oklahoma's been playing lately. So, no, get out of here, man. Like, 13 is insane to me. And look, maybe we'll look up, on Tuesday night, and Alabama will be sitting there at number 13, right on the cusp. I frankly hope not. It's just, I don't know what their case is at this point. If you play a lot of games against pretty good opponents and you barely win half of them, like, that doesn't make you elite. It just doesn't. And I mean, looking at the AP poll right now, like, they're ahead of Arizona State. I think that's wrong. Like, I think that you start to get into a conversation about South Carolina over them, to be quite honest. Like, I just don't even think that they're especially notable for a 3-loss SEC team.
Yeah, that's a problem. South Carolina, like Kansas, is seeming to do better right now. Their season's getting stronger. They're a team that's found their groove, and they're looking really strong, and they have an equal record. Now, again, no the head-to-head, but it was a close game. And at this point, I would rather be, if I were a coach, I would rather play Alabama, depending on, especially right now. I can't even imagine what it's going to be like for them. The Iron Bowl suddenly got a lot more interesting, especially after that upset that Hugh Freeze and company pulled on Texas A&M. So, boy, that's going to be one. And I agree. I think it's time for Alabama to take a rest. There's some other opportunities. Again, I think 13 was too high. But we'll see if the College Football Playoff Committee has it any different. What did our listeners think?
Yeah, good question. So, like we mentioned, I'm certainly voting for them to be out of our field. Our listeners, with 91% of the vote, said get them out of here. So,
yeah, they were.
So Alabama, you are out.
They were chomping at the bit for that one. My goodness. Well,
speaking of chomping at the bit, let's quickly touch on another SEC team who 94% of our voters said, get the hell out of here. And that's Ole Miss. Ole Miss this past week, they play a game against Florida, and Florida's a team they're in the. I'm sure that this is what Florida fans love to hear. They're in the Kansas mold a little bit, where they've started to figure some things out in the latter half of the year. Although Florida was way worse than Kansas in the first half of the year. Kansas played a lot of close games, whereas Florida's kind of figured some stuff out, especially on defense. Everybody's pointing to Lagway, but their defense has gotten a lot better. But if you're Ole Miss and you're trying to make the college football freaking playoff, you can't go on the road and lose to Florida. You just can't do it. And here's the other piece of it too. Let's just for a second take the Georgia game out of their resume just to evaluate, right? So they beat South Carolina 27-3 earlier in the year when South Carolina was sort of figuring things out. That's still a good win. Still a good win. You lost to Kentucky. That's horrendous. That is embarrassing. You lost on the road at LSU. That looks like a way worse loss than it did a couple weeks ago. You only beat Oklahoma 26-14. You lost to Florida. And cool, you put up a bunch of points against an overmatched Arkansas team. That sucks, to be honest. That is a terrible resume overall. And now that we have the third loss, it's over. I don't care that you beat Georgia. I don't care. You have 3 bad losses. You don't have a whole lot of very good wins at this point. 1 or 2, maybe. No, you're done. You're done.
What a flip after a bye week. Because they were riding so high after beating Georgia. And they were like, we finally did it. We're going to be in the playoff. It's going to be us and Penn State together at last, And my gosh, 1 bye week. And then you come back and completely lay an egg in Gainesville. And, I just don't see it. I just don't. And the thing is, looking at their resume, they are back to being Ole Miss like they always were, running up a great score under Lane Kiffin and then just bombing an occasional big game. Or even except this, it wasn't even the big game. That's the thing. They didn't bomb the big games. LSU is kind of but again, Georgia, they made it, but then they just completely the trade. What did they trade? They traded 3 ugly losses, and it is just absolutely ridiculous.
And I think you have to say, heading into the season, Ole Miss was picked number 6 in the preseason poll, and they had as easy a pathway to the college football playoff as anybody in the SEC this year. We knew that they had Georgia late in the year. We didn't think that Oklahoma was going to be as bad as they ended up being, but there were no other guaranteed ranked games on the schedule. South Carolina's overperformed. LSU was going to maybe be in the ranked range, although now they've fallen out. So actually, maybe that they're even worse than we thought. They could have made the playoff at 10-2 and just cruised in. But they blew it. It's crazy. If you had told me entering the year that Ole Miss was going to beat Georgia, I'd assume they're 11-1 at the worst. For them to be 8-3 heading into the Egg Bowl, it's just a failure. It's just a failure.
I have to say one thing I wanted to mention, actually, when we were talking about Alabama. It is remarkable that at this point in the season, we're calling a loss to Oklahoma worse than a loss to Vanderbilt. I don't know any time in my memory that's ever been a sentence about
any time in
team.
History.
Yeah, especially because thankfully, thanks to conference realignment, certainly the first time in history anyone's had to make that comparison. On one season schedule. My goodness. So okay, I think unanimous. The 2 of us plus our listeners, we're taking Ole Miss off, and we'll get to who are going to potentially replace Alabama and Ole Miss with. But then we get to, and I think this is a good transition one, because with BYU, if we remove them, we have to replace them. So this is a good kind of mixed conversation here. So BYU has now taken their 2nd loss in a row. The first one to Kansas, okay, let's see how they bounce back. And again, this was a close loss. Arizona State has ended up being quite good, picked to finish last, and they're actually very much in the Big 12 title race right now. In fact, they're on the. Are they in the board of control? I don't even know if they're control their own destiny. It's so hard to even know in that conference. But what we do know is they're a serious contender. They have only 2 losses at this point. It's almost a question of, if we remove BYU, which has come up before, and why we kept them last week, who would we replace them with? We were ready to say if they lose again, it's Colorado's time to shine, but then Colorado took a loss. There's Arizona State out there. There's Iowa State out there. They're all potential candidates. Who would be the one you would pick if we replace them?
Yeah, I think that it's Arizona State. They're the new favorite in the Big 12. Actually, 73% of our voters said that Arizona State should be in now after what happened last week. Crazy game. BYU had a throw with 1 second left because 1 second was put on the clock after Arizona State's crowd rushed the field. But
And they took
it
down the
felt
goalposts, not physically, like they purposely took
yes,
them down. Like,
yes,
but can
yes,
you
yes.
imagine if they ripped them down?
I
Oh
know,
my!
I know. It would be something else. And so, like, and by the way, BYU connected on their Hail Mary pass. They were just 3 yards short.
Oh,
And so Arizona State is the team to beat. After 2 losses, I think that BYU is just in trouble at this point. I just think that Arizona State is the team that's emerging. And I think that to look back a little bit at Arizona State's resume, they lost earlier this season to Cincinnati, but I believe that Sam Levitt, their quarterback, was hurt during that game, and Jeff Sims was the starting quarterback. They also lost earlier this season to Texas Tech in a pretty close game, but they were still sort of figuring things out. And since then, I mean, again, outside of that Cincinnati game, they've won 6 of their last 7 overall. So they're 9-2. They've beaten BYU and Kansas State over the past 2 weeks. I mean, this is a resume that's starting to hold up decently well. And again, they have to play at Arizona in their final week of the year, and Arizona is desperate, just completely desperate for any positive thing to happen to their program after coming into the year with so much expectation. But I think though, like, you still look at this Arizona State team and you think at 10-2, they should get into the Big 12 title game. They're probably going to be favored over whoever they play in that game. And so I think that Arizona State deserves to be in over BYU. BYU had their chances, certainly, but I think it's Arizona State's time.
yeah, absolutely. It's by the way, it's really funny because I remember it was a Cincinnati game where Jeff Sims came in, and there was a conversation in these, on Reddit, fans talking to each other. And when it was announced, Arizona State fans were like, "He can just hand the ball off, right? It shouldn't be that hard." And all the Nebraska fans and the Georgia Tech fans were like, "Good luck." And they lost the game. So again, I don't want to put it all on Sim's shoulders. It isn't just one player, but my goodness. That said, I think Arizona State has earned its spot, and it is absolutely one of the greatest stories in college football, and it's been happening quietly because even early in the season we talked about it before they had that kind of sorting out game with Texas State, which was a midweek game, Sun Belt dark horse. Texas State might have been they early at that stage they were kind of hopeful as well. And Arizona State, which had that win over Wyoming that was, decisive, which we can't say for Boise State. It had that great, Mississippi State, but still, everyone was like, oh, wow, they're 3-0. As it turns out, they are one of I think Kurt Cignetti and Kenny Dillingham are two of the best candidates we have right now for Coach of the Year because these two teams should not be where they are. Now, I think Indiana, oddly enough, their brand helps that award because Indiana's just been so bad for so long. Arizona State's occasionally had a wild season where you're kind of like, oh, whoa, the Sun Devils might do it. I'm old enough to remember when they were a bowl loss away from a national championship. I'm all for putting them in. I think they are the leader of the pack. It would have been Colorado, but Colorado, again, you can't just lose at Kansas. Even though Kansas is good, if you're supposed to be a good team, you can beat a good team. Iowa State, they're just kind of hanging out, and I don't blame them. They just got to win. They've just got to win. And Farmageddon with Kansas State is going to be absolutely fantastic. It's going to be one of those games that's going to have some determination. But at least for now, we have room for one Big 12 team, and that is Arizona State. So now we have two other potential spots because we let out Alabama, we let out Ole Miss.
Actually,
What do you think?
let's real quick. What would be the funniest Big 12 title game with the knowledge that Neo is performing at halftime? So, what would be the two schools least well suited for Neo to be performing? I think that BYU has to be one of them. I don't think that Neo is exactly BYU R&B music. But I don't know. Is it Iowa
Baylor?
State?
Hmm?
I think that Baylor. Well, okay. See, here's the thing. If Baylor, if Neo, we're talking late '90s, then I think that that's trouble because Baylor wasn't allowed to dance at that point. But I think modern Baylor handles that a little better. Uh, so it gets interesting, right? Obviously, Colorado would have by far been the best scenario for Neo. That would have made a lot of sense. That's not the world that we're working in right now, though. But yeah, Arizona State's a heck of a party school, so I'm sure that they would. I'm sure that they would handle things. Well, how about a BYU Iowa State Neo halftime game? Can I interest you in that?
I would love to watch that. That would be great. I hope they let fans on the field kind of bop their heads to it. We get some memes out of that one. It'd be like that Friday music video with the one girl who's kind of trying to dance in the car and, all that stuff. I love it. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I love it. There's so many scenarios here. I mean, technically, West Virginia, Iowa State's on the table. Maybe they would be the ultimate
West
fan base.
Virginia would be a crazy one. That would make no
West Virginia fans like, all right. And then don't get me wrong, they definitely know how to party in Morgantown, but oh my goodness.
Not like that, though. It's a different type of party.
Yeah, light some couches on fire in the middle of the stadium. People, they'll be at home. They'll be at home. So, okay, who do you think we should potentially replace? I mean, I think the two leading candidates, and I could be wrong, Miami, because it's crazy they're still not in there. They're just by nature of attrition. They're AP number 8, and Tennessee, which is AP number 7. Actually, do I have Miami off by there? Are they still only at number 8? Yeah, they are. Wow. They are. And then Tennessee at AP number 7. The SEC team that went from being looking outside, looking in, being upset, angry, their fans raging against Indiana. They're not raging about Indiana anymore because, their 56-0 crush of UTEP picked the best week to have it. All they have to do is just get past Vandy. Oh, how many teams have said that this season? But what do you think? What do you make of this? And of course, just to be clear, also, of course, Miami's going on the road to Syracuse, playing in the Dome to wrap up their regular season.
Yeah, by the way, a fun quarterback matchup: Cam Ward versus Kyle McCord. That is going to be a lot of fun. So Miami, I think, should be in. Miami should be in. The hesitation for us was that we felt like there was only going to be one ACC team in the field. Now that the door is open, and I would argue likely that the ACC is going to get 2 teams in, I think that Miami is absolutely a team that should be in. 63% of our voters agreed that Miami should be in. I still think that I personally like SMU and where they're at more, but we don't have to ask that question anymore if Miami also has the chance to be in. And the other thing, too, is that they're a one-loss team, but they are a team that's still that with 2 losses, with one coming in a conference title game, they still should be in pretty good shape overall.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating to see that. How Clemson does against South Carolina is also going to be an interesting game out there in this week. We're not going to really Clemson isn't really as credible a candidate to fit in right now as Miami, because again, Miami has only 1 loss. Absolutely fascinating stuff. I think Miami has earned their spot back in through a mix of, really just attrition ahead of them. And speaking of attrition ahead of them, Tennessee, they seem to be right now the best SEC team in that two loss group left at this point, or at least the one that should be in. Texas A&M completely threw up their opportunity in 4 overtimes at Auburn, so they're no longer part of it. I mean, granted, Georgia exists, and but I don't know. It's so weird. I cannot tell who in the SEC is going to be good enough to win the whole playoff. I mean, we are at a stage where I don't know. After Alabama lost the way it did, I feel like my entire system of viewing the SEC just got its legs kicked out from under it. Granted, their other losses were similar. I mean, the Vanderbilt loss, but I mean, this is just what to make. I would not be shocked if we had multiple SEC upsets, not necessarily against other SEC teams, but I wouldn't be madly shocked if Georgia Tech somehow beat Georgia, because they've had their own crazy games. They knocked off Miami. I mean, I'm sure Georgia's more than ready for them, but I wouldn't be shocked if, the Iron Bowl goes Auburn's way. I wouldn't be shocked if Vanderbilt knocks off Tennessee. I would expect those favorite teams to win, but I don't know. All of that said, at this point, it seems Tennessee's in the pole position.
Yeah, Tennessee's in. I don't feel good about it. I don't think that they're especially good. I don't think that their resume is especially good, but like they have a win over Alabama that should help carry them, and they're also going to be a 2-loss SEC team. So if they beat Vanderbilt, I think that they're in, whether you sort of like it or not. I mean, looking at the AP poll, I would have Tennessee behind Miami and SMU. I think that Tennessee versus Indiana is a discussion, at least. Now, all this said, that still would put them in the top 10. That still would put them in playoff position. Uh, it's really interesting, right? And we're gonna in the second half of this show get into it a little deeper. But like, I think the question, especially from the SEC, of who can actually win the national championship, it like it's not an awesome list, I don't think, this year because, again, Texas will have one, maybe two games to prove themselves. They can climb up, certainly. Georgia, I think, definitely can win the national title, but this has been a wildly inconsistent team this year. I don't think Tennessee can win the national title. I do not think that they have the offensive firepower to keep up. And then again, you're like in the Alabama, Ole Miss, South Carolina, Texas A&M camp. Like that is not an inspiring list, to be quite honest. And so I don't know. This is such an interesting year, and like you said, I mean, Tennessee plays Vanderbilt. That is not a gimme game. Although I do think that their defense matches up well with what Vanderbilt's going to try to do against them.
I do wonder if next week we'll be having a discussion of which 3-loss SEC teams should be in.
I think we might. I think we
yeah.
might.
Oh my goodness. I mean, all right. And there's the benefit of Texas week schedule. They wouldn't be in the 3-loss group. In the worst case scenario heading into next week. But okay. Well, after we come back from this break, we are going to talk really about which, if any of these teams are playoff locks here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
Well, as we said, this is kind of a weird season. I mean, so many of these teams have taken losses. Teams we thought were going to have no trouble have lost in just mysterious ways. Obviously, Alabama most recently, but Georgia's loss a couple of weeks ago to Ole Miss kind of was a bit of a shocker in a way. So many teams have lost in manners that we just did not expect. One team, or there's one. Okay, so here's it. Like, let's go through are there any teams you would consider a safe playoff lock at this point? And let me just be clear. A safe playoff lock could afford to lose everything else in front of them.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And that's a big thing, right? So like, look, we anticipate that Georgia will beat Georgia Tech, but this is assuming that they lose that game, right? This is assuming that Notre Dame loses to USC. This is assuming that, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are 4 locks. I do think that there are 4 locks. I think that 2 of them are much more locks than the others, but the number 1 lock is Oregon, and Oregon has the potential to lose 2 more games because they already are clinched when it comes to making the Big Ten title game. So they have Washington this week, and one, I think that they should be fine, but and also, like, this is a team that has had their number the last 2 years because Kalen DeBoer was previously the coach there. Turns out it's a lot more fun to be the coach at Washington than it is at Alabama. Who could have guessed that? But I think that that even if Oregon loses that game and then hypothetically loses to Ohio State or whoever in the Big Ten title game, I think they're fine. I think that they're in. They would be an 11-2 Big Ten team. I certainly think it would help them a little bit if it's, Dylan Gabriel was a little banged up or like if they had like a clear excuse for why those 2 losses happened. But I still do think overall they are a stone cold lock. I'm also going to throw out Ohio State. Ohio State is a 1-loss team right now. They have wins over both Indiana and Penn State head to head. They play Michigan this week in a big rivalry game. I think if they lose that, yes, they'll still be in the playoff. Also, Ryan Day might be set on fire or shot to space or
Yeah,
dismembered.
we're asking if they would be good under an interim head coach. No.
Yes. Well, assuming that Ryan Day is in witness protection, I still assume that that Ohio State will be in the college football playoff. But look, I think Ohio State's probably going to beat Michigan this year, but I think that even if they lose that game, it actually is like a minor benefit that they would miss out on the Big Ten title game in that case, because they would be a 2-loss team, and I think that if they lost the Big Ten title game, they'd maybe actually be in trouble. But the fact that they'd be a 10-2 team from the Big Ten, I think they'd be fine. This gets slightly into another conversation of whether it's more beneficial to miss the conference title game. I want to be clear, that is not the case. Having a first round bye is going to be incredibly valuable. And also, by the way, if Ohio State loses that game, they probably aren't hosting a home playoff game. If they were to lose to Michigan, like, I think that they would be at risk of losing that right. And that would be a huge deal if they had to travel on the road to play somebody else, especially. But I think that that Ohio State's a lock. The two teams that are probably locks but are not 1000% locks, I think Texas is a lock. They would only have the losses to Georgia and Texas A&M if they lost, and they would also miss out on a conference title game. So they'd finish 10-2. I think with the amount of movement behind them, they'd be okay. Heading into last week, I would have not considered them a lock, but the amount of 3-loss SEC teams that there are right now, I think that they'd be okay, even though their resume would be kind of awful, to be honest. Like, they would not have any wins that anybody would care about if they finish 10-2. But I still think as a 10 or 11 seed, they probably still get in. The last one, and I'm curious your thoughts on this one, is Notre Dame. So Notre Dame, if they lose, it would be to USC, which would not be a great loss, but also wouldn't be like the worst loss in history. It's on the road. But the thing that you look at is that over the past however many weeks since the Northern Illinois game, they played one sort of close game against Louisville and otherwise have like beaten everybody else off the planet. This past week, they beat Army by 35 points. They have an 18-point win over Georgia Tech. They have a 42-point win over Stanford. They have a 66-7 win over Purdue. So like, they've kind of just been playing at a high level overall. And I think that as long as they don't get embarrassed by USC, I think that Notre Dame as a 10-2 team is still in. But again, like, you are to an extent putting yourself at the mercy of the committee in that case. But again, I think that at 10-2, with how weak the bubble is after all the SEC losses, I think they still get in.
I could definitely hear Ward Manuel talking after USC ekes out a win and saying, like, USC actually has been better than their record indicates. They have been leading in the fourth quarter in every loss they've had. They just haven't had trouble putting it together. They took Penn State into overtime. That overtime loss to Penn State was their only home loss. They've been strong in the Coliseum, which is where they defeated Notre Dame. I'm hearing all of this. Like, I can, blah, blah, blah. We compared something. He'll just say something I don't even know. Sometimes it's not even something they're supposed to be comparing him on. I could see him legitimizing Notre Dame in that way. So yeah, I think what we would see is Notre Dame just fall into a visiting first round game, not a home first round game. Unless USC decides to completely come alive in a way they simply only did against Utah State, unless it turns into that kind of a beatdown, which I'm highly doubting. Notre Dame should have no trouble. It would take a truly embarrassing game. And in which case, if that were to occur, then everyone's going to suddenly look back at Notre Dame's schedule and kind of go, beating up the service academies, isn't that impressive? And you just go all the way back through that horrible schedule again. Not their fault. Florida State ended up being just a complete basket case this season. And Texas A&M taking another loss once again did not help the Fighting Irish in this situation. So I'm just looking back at it. Yeah, it would be awkward. It would be awkward, but I think they would, unless something really goes right. I think they're the closest to a lock. Frankly, I guess they are closer than Texas. Or pardon me, I think Texas is closer than they are. I just people will have trouble with it because of the strength of schedule if Texas takes a second loss. But as you're right, they would be boxed out of taking a third loss. That's actually to their advantage. If you're going to take a loss, take it there. Well, no, actually, it'd still look okay if they won at Texas A&M and then lost in the SEC title game. I just want to go back to Ohio State for a second. There is a fathomable scenario. I mean, less likely than most, but not like as likely as West Virginia making it to the Big 12 title game. If they lose and Penn State and Indiana both somehow manage to lose, it would still end up with them in the Big 10 title game. And imagine if they took a third loss. What would happen? Well, then I don't even want setting aside Ryan Day jokes. What would happen? I mean, would they be in it anymore?
Well, I think that they'd still probably be in, because two of their losses would be to the overwhelming, at that point, number one team in the country. So I do think like all of this assumes that like just the normal world exists, right? So like if they lose 70-0 to Oregon, then yeah, I mean they're probably not in.
Right.
But I think that like in the scope of like realistic loss and like realistic competition, I think that they'd be okay. Even if they were a third loss. I will say too, and this is actually a point that I think that we should touch on. So conference championship games have pros and cons, right? So like if you make it and you win, like that is a huge deal to get a first round bye. If you lose it, you pick up another loss. So I want to talk for a second about how the committee would view losses in a conference championship game. My opinion is that I don't think that they'll get held much against teams. Now, in 2017, I brought this up a couple of times. TCU played Oklahoma in the first 1v2 Big 12 title game, and Oklahoma was really good that year, and TCU was pretty good, but not that good. And they, I believe, entered at number 9 and lost the game by 21 points, which pushed them down to number 13 in the CFP rankings, which actually pushed them all the way out of the New Year's Six. So, look, if you lose big in the conference title game, I think that will hurt you. But if you lose a competitive game, that like I don't think that they're going to view it as like let's take Texas for example, right? Let's say that Texas wins and loses to Georgia, and then all of a sudden they're a two-loss team. I don't think that they're going to be treated necessarily as a two-loss team, or the better comparison would be like if there was a two-loss team and they lose a third. I don't think that they'll be treated like a full-on three-loss team when they've played an extra game against a good opponent that nobody else has. But actually, I think here's another example of it, right? Like, let's say that that Clemson were to make it in to the ACC title game against SMU, and SMU at this point is like number 6, and Clemson's like number 12 or something like that. Well, like I think that they'll be treated more like a 2-loss team by the committee than a 3-loss team, as long as that game is competitive. Now, I also do think that if they lose that game, like I think it'll matter. I think it'll count whenever you're trying to compare them. And the way that it was described by Rich Clark, the executive director of the CFP, was like, I mean, that is a 13th data point, and we are going to consider a 13th data point because it is a data point. I just don't think that we're going to end up in a position where it's like, well, Clemson lost a third game, so now they're in with the SEC 3-loss teams, right? Like, I don't think it's going to be talked about and considered like that. Or even, I think another example would be if Texas loses to Georgia after beating Texas A&M. I don't think that they'll be like, oh, well, Texas is a 2-loss team. Well, Tennessee is also a 2-loss team from the SEC. These are the same. I don't think they're going to be treated like that.
You know what I'm curious to see? If Texas A&M beats Texas, they are, I believe, in the SEC title game. What if they lose badly in the SEC title game? And in which case would they have just been happy to wrap their season up by beating Texas?
Well, I do want to say this too. So I don't think that Texas A&M, for example, in that case, because let's say they beat Texas, right? They would be a 9-3 team, so already a 3-loss team. To be clear,
Mhm.
I think that entering the rankings, let's say next week, right? Let's say that they beat Texas. I think that in the rankings, they would still be like, so Georgia would be ahead of them from the SEC. Texas would still be ahead of them, most likely from the SEC, unless Texas A&M destroys them, in which case it's probably more Texas falling than
Mhm.
Texas A&M moving up. Tennessee will most likely be ahead of them. And then you get into the Alabamas and the South Carolinas. I think Texas A&M is probably fourth in that case, but like they would not be ranked as the second team in the SEC by the committee. And so if they lose that game, I don't think that the committee's just going to be like, well, they finished second place in the SEC, they should be in. I think that they'll be I don't think they'll be treated as a
Yeah, I
four-loss team.
agree. I absolutely
Yeah,
agree.
I don't think they'd be treated as a four-loss team, but I think that they'd kind of be treated as a 9-3 overall, which like I don't think that 9-3 team, even with the win over Texas, I don't think that team makes the playoff,
Mm.
regardless of having a conference championship game. So I don't think that Texas A&M's station is going to change that much based on whether or not they play for an SEC title, and instead, what they get is an opportunity to play their way into the field and also play their way into essentially a guaranteed first round bye if they beat the University of Georgia. So to me, there's only advantages if you're Texas A&M if you make the conference championship game. And we've talked about this extensively. I would argue we've been first on it ahead of everybody. People do not understand how much a bye is going to matter in these scenarios. Like playing one less game against a quality opponent uh, at a time when everybody else is playing and essentially getting an off week and a bye week to prepare for the college football playoff is going to be a huge deal because the college football playoff is going to be a battle of attrition. And if you have to play 3 games versus 4 games, it's going to be a huge advantage. So I think like making a conference championship game and winning a conference championship is going to be incredibly valuable.
One other team I want to mention. If Penn State loses to Maryland, are they still a lock?
I don't think so. I don't think so. The issue with them is that they because I think that it's similar to like, well, not necessarily similar, but I think it's comparable to like if Indiana loses to Purdue, are they a lock? Like I don't think anybody would say that. The issue is they would be a 10-2 team from the Big Ten, but without really any quality wins. Like they have a top 25 win that's like 23 against Illinois, and that's kind of it. They don't really have anything else to point to if they lose to Maryland. Like their second best data point is losing to Ohio State in a game that really wasn't as close as 20-13. So I think that there's a decent chance that they'd still make it, especially with what's going on in the SEC, but I don't think that they're a lock in that case. I don't think that you can put them as a lock to make the college football playoff at this point.
I just think it would be a pretty far drop from number 4. Like it would have to
It
be,
would.
it would be
And
a
and
shocker.
and
That's why I
frankly,
would be.
yeah, frankly, a big part of this is that I don't think that Penn State should be number 4 right now, but I think it's a sort of loss that if they lose that game, you're reevaluating their whole resume, like what we did with Ole Miss, right? Where it's
Yeah.
like this isn't just one loss, this is have you done anything? Have you done anything that we should care about at this point? Again, I don't anticipate this happening. I think Penn State's going to make the field. I will be curious to see this upcoming week if Notre Dame moves ahead of Penn State in the CFP rankings. I think that could be on the table, but I think that Penn State is just tenuous enough that you can't consider them a true lock. Though I think Penn State's probably going to beat Maryland.
Yeah, they probably will. And again, if they lost, it would probably be some close freak game where people would be
Yeah.
kind of talking about it for ages. And yeah, no, I'm not. But they were the only other team I think could fathomably take an L this week and still be it because they're out. They wouldn't make at that point. They absolutely wouldn't make the championship game. They could theoretically. Now, I think they would be they'd certainly be a lock if Ohio State stumbles and Penn State ends up, going against Oregon and taking a loss there, I don't think there's going to be. I think they'll still be in.
Fine.
Indiana would be an interesting one too. Let's say Indiana, again, we're going to assume Purdue's so awful. They're going to beat Purdue, and then somehow all hell breaks loose and Penn State and Ohio State go down. So they end up going and losing to Oregon and losing both games against the top teams. Well, Ohio State wouldn't be one of the top 2 teams anymore, but one of the top teams in America.
Yeah, I think they'd be fine in that case. Some of this depends on how the committee chooses to view Oregon. My assumption, considering the fact that Ohio State, even before all of this chaos, was clear number 2, is that they view Oregon as being really, really good right now. Because I think you can make the comparison in some ways between Ohio State and Texas, who both have great analytic profiles, who outside of their one really big game have been kind of Ohio State has Penn State. That's definitely a factor. But I think that you can view the committee as saying, no, Oregon is really, really good. And we are not going to punish a team. Now, again, like you always leave open the possibility that it just is embarrassing, right? Like that it's just like awful, awful, awful. That it's 49-0, like Ohio State, Wisconsin. I don't think even then you really look at Indiana being left out with the SEC teams that we'd be looking to include.
Yeah.
But like I feel like if they make a conference title game and lose, I still feel like Indiana will be okay.
One more team I wanted us to touch on, Georgia. If they manage to lose the rivalry game to Georgia Tech and then lose the SEC title game against whoever comes up, would they still be in? Because right now, they're sitting at AP number 6. They were 12 in the CFP last week, but we're assuming they've moved up roughly there based on their not based on their win against UMass, but based on just attrition around them. What do we think there?
Yeah, I really don't think so. I really don't think so because yes, you'd be looking at a 4-loss team, but like I think that the bigger thing is like you just have so many inconsistent performances when you look back at their resume. Now, I still think that they'd have a shot. Like I don't think that they'd be eliminated if those two things happen, but I don't think that they'd be a lock in that scenario. Because you'd have again, your big wins would be, are really good wins, right? You beat Texas, you beat Tennessee, but then you'd have a loss to Georgia Tech, which wouldn't be great. You'd have a 3-score loss to an Ole Miss team that really is not looking very good right now. You have a loss to Alabama where, you claw your way back into that thing, but it was 28-0 at one point. You have a 1-point win over Kentucky that was pretty terrible. You were down when DJ Lagway went out against Florida. And then again, like you're talking about either Texas coming back and getting revenge in the SEC title game, which would then imply that Texas has gotten better and you've probably gotten worse since you played in Austin, or you're losing to a Texas A&M team that probably will be like number 18 in the country. So I don't think that there's necessarily an acceptable scenario for you to feel like we are a stone cold lock at that point. I think if you win one of those 2 games, you're probably okay. If you beat Georgia Tech but then lose to Texas or Texas A&M, I think that you're still probably in. Or if you lose to Georgia Tech but obviously win the SEC, then obviously you're still in. But if you go 0-2, I think that again, you just throw yourself up to the mercy of the committee, and I don't think you're a lock.
I just have to say there would be some humor in all the barking Kirby Smart did, and I don't blame him for doing it. It's all about politicking and barking because it's Georgia, of course.
Yeah,
about
I got that.
about rankings and all that stuff, only to watch them get eked out by Indiana for the final playoff spot. That would be. I can't even imagine how seething and angry his statements are going to get after that. Possibly to the point of getting fined. But I wouldn't blame him. But oh my goodness, there's so much excitement. I love this. This is the fact that we only really, honest to goodness, have 2 agreed upon locks, which were Ohio State and Oregon, maybe Texas, maybe Notre Dame, maybe even Penn State. I'm not sure. But like, really, this is just such a spectacular inaugural 12-team season that it is absolute chaos. We thought some people were fearing it's going to be like an obvious answer, it's going to be ridiculous, and it's been ridiculous, but for the greatest possible reasons. all the reasons we love college football. If you love chaos, this is going to be a weekend to be hoping for upsets, because then no one's going to know what the hell's going on. Thank you all for listening. This has been the College Football Survivor Show. I wanted to thank, again, not just you for listening. I want to thank our producers, Joey Aliberti, for being a part of our show. Wanted to remind you, please take a second to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan J. Raja. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan J. Raja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Kyrie, part of the group that runs Reddit CFB. Thanks for listening.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.